One of the best ways to understand literature is to talk about it with others. Too often, we view the study of literature as a silent endeavor. This is a mistake. Group discussions of fiction, poetry, drama help us to encounter the work through the eyes of others, enabling us to see things differently. In the following discussion, Dr. Bert Kimmelman, Dr. Nancy Steffenfleur, and I chat about modern North American poetry. Let's see what this discussion yields.
Well, I'd like to pick up on, I guess, one of the things I reacted to in your original lecture that you just came close to ending with now is the line by Marianne Moore, "Poetry, I too dislike it," which is somehow, and to think of her, she was someone who was popularly as famous for going to Brooklyn Dodger games as she was for writing poetry. And that combination somehow, the statement, but it goes back to, I think, the search for an American idiom and a kind of defensiveness that's so American. Both the valuing of simplicity and a kind of distrust of anything that's too fancy. Even artists, it's typical that an American artist would, in the process of making very great art, say something about being a little suspicious of art, and that would be part of the American idiom because it's fancy and it's not straightforward. And so what you're talking about in terms of American poetry, I think one can talk about in terms of a kind of the American character itself, including some things that we might want to examine more about our own character.
It's interesting how many 20th century American poets write poems about baseball, for example. Williams has this marvelous poem called At the Ballpark. Yeah. And you can't imagine an English poet writing, of course, there was no baseball, but can you imagine a 19th century English poet writing about, well, some of the Romantics, but certainly not prior to the Romantics, yeah, right. Sports or any other everyday kind of folk activity, let's say.
And baseball, of course, has a kind of, particularly during certain seasons, but has a kind of holiness to it. It's associated deeply with the American character, but that search for an idiom that isn't European, that's distinctive to us, and yet a kind of defensiveness about doing it. And maybe even there is something American about a distrust of romantic emotion itself that is modernist, but has particularly kind of American spin to it that we see in our poetry that I don't think one would find in other cultures. That goes along with a distrust of things that are fancy and a belief in somehow that one sees in this poem, a returning to a focus on the thing itself, that material world that is very real and one can sort of count on. Maybe we need to examine our own national insecurities a little bit more. We can certainly do that in this poetry, but that was a point anyhow that I reacted to with some delight in what you were talking about.
What I was thinking, though, as I was listening to you talk, is what do we do with Wallace Stevens? Wallace Stevens writes the poem of the mind in the act of finding what will suffice. That very long, very simple, drawn-out sentence that seems to echo the kind of thought that he's having when he's having it, which is a highly rigorous, kind of highly intellectual thought. So while we're saying that William Carlos Williams is doing a certain thing and he's calling attention to the things itself, I wonder what we do with Wallace Stevens in this.
Well, ideologically, in terms of talking about whether the emphasis in the poetry should be on the self or on the material and otherwise the things of the world, and actually we might want to make a distinction between object and thing. A thing, that is to say, we might want to call the objects closer to something being inert, and of course for the objectivist poet, such as Zukofsky or Williams, the energy or the vitality had to do with the fact that the seer of the world, in some sense, became not passive, but within the equation of positive and negative, the seer was the passive one, or the inert one, as it were, and so there was the vitality came through the act of perception of the things out, or the objects out in the world, or the things in the world. But in other words, thing, we might not want to think of the word thing sort of as the philosopher Martin Heidegger talked about thing as a gathering, that the world gathers within the thing. It's very active, very dynamic. And Stevens really is talking about the seeing of things and the knowing, or the relationship, the world coming alive through the realization of the things of the world. Rather than enumerate the things, Stevens comes at the same phenomenology from the abstract side of it, and says it's the poem of the mind. In other words, whatever the words are, finally it's the act of perception, or it's the act of engaging the world that is the real poem, and of finding the things that will suffice, finding the matrix that will contain this vitality, this engagement. And the self there.
Stevens, isn't that a much more rigorously intellectual thing than it is for Williams?
Absolutely. Stevens is his skepticism is marvelous, and he's just a deeply philosophical poet. Williams, to me, has a wonderful mind, and his poems have a philosophical underpinning to them. That is a philosophy that is rigorous. But Williams is not he doesn't go about philosophizing. He's not interested in playing off of philosophical discourse, whereas Stevens is. I mean, Stevens, of course, we have to remember, he's not a philosopher, he's a poet. But he gets his kicks, so to speak, from playing off of the kind of talk that philosophers do. And so he's very interested in how the world is known. Finally, to try and that points back to the self, the knower. Although he's not going to talk about the knower, he's going to talk about the problem of knowing. The Romantics would talk about the knower. If you think of a poem like Ode on a Grecian Urn by John Keats, or Ode to a Nightingale, it's this wonderful connection between the work of art, or in the urn, or the nightingale, and the knower. But it very much has to do with the reaction of the knower. Whereas in the 20th century, either you end up talking about the landscape, or you talk about how you come to know the landscape, but without referring to the self. It's the epistemology of it, to use a $10 word. It's the act of coming to know. And that's what Stevens does marvelously. Now, of course, also, you have to say about Stevens that he, in a way, breaks the mold. His language can be wonderfully Baroque, but if you look very carefully at that language, you listen to it, it has a marvelous, subtle humor to it. It's extremely ironic in the way it is modulating European discourse and European Baroqueness, European fanciness. He always, he'll have something that, I wish I had a line in front of me just to think, but he'll have some wonderfully beautiful vision, wonderfully textured visually, with wonderful colors, and all of a sudden the language slips from rationality into irrationality, until he's talking about hoo-has or gigaws or something, really weird. So there's still a dissonance there. And I think that goes back to what you're saying about just a refusal, a suspiciousness and sort of common senseness, and a refusal to accept the European way.
When I went to school, I actually had once as a teacher Ivor Winters, who you may know, who was very suspicious about romanticism as in terms of projecting yourself either as a critic or as a poet onto the landscape. And so I was raised to study very carefully the kind of commonsensical but not commonsensical notion that you talked about before, that poems are made of words, and that one shouldn't forget that. And yet it strikes me again that that's characteristically American too,
Yes.
but in some of the ways we were talking about before. But you talked about in your second lecture, more than your first lecture, moving on to the second half of the period you're covering, really, about how one never leaves the self. It's rather difficult to do that, but what constitutes a self in poetry is defined in very different ways, certainly in the postmodern period. I wondered, should we pick that up a little bit and emphasize that? It seemed to me such a crucial point that would the Romantics recognize what now in poetry constitutes a discourse of the self? How are the Romantics thinking about the self differently than we tend to think about it now?
Well, if you think about so much of post-World War II poetry, the confessionalism of it, for example, the pouring out of intimate details with a pose of candor, I mean, that is very interesting. But also, I think, even more interesting in a way, this really digresses from what you're saying in part, but very quickly, even more interesting in a way is the fact that the modernists wanted to, Mallarmé said a poem is made out of words, not out of arguments or ideas. And the modernists wanted to create that, and they did manage to avoid having closure in their poems, but still the poems were not just the words. But that's set a stage for what we see in a poem like Why Am I Not a Painter? By O'Hara, or again Rich's poem, where really the experience is in the reading of the poem. You really feel a self there talking, and the self doesn't make any sense necessarily, but you're engaging another soul, another creature through those words.
Well, I'm wondering if this doesn't put us out of business, though. I mean, because if the idea is that the image is supposed to be most important, engagement is most important, does this speak against interpretation?
What do you think?
Well, I think interpretation has enormous shortcomings. I am constantly moved with my own students about how much better they do if they read and reread and reread again, and do other things besides interpret or pose an argument. But if they ask questions about what they're doing, or try to find relationships in a web between one thing or another, or try to talk about what an image means to them, or to try to talk about the particular voice that emerges and how that reminds them of another voice that they've perhaps encountered in their own autobiographical selves. Now, I don't know if any of those things are what I traditionally think of as interpretation, which is sort of my attempt as an English teacher to scaffold up the red wheelbarrow and put it in a unit, and to try to bring a whole repertoire of things to understanding it, as opposed to concentrating in sort of an Eastern way on the poem itself and experiencing that, and moving away from interpretation, moving towards more understanding. So I'm wondering if your argument either puts us out of business or makes us think about these things a little more carefully when we introduce them to our students, or what we expect our students to do with them. If the image is the thing that's most important, and we're supposed to be concentrating on the image, what do we do with interpretation?
Well, that reminds me of something a scholar said not long ago, talking about some of the recent in vogue Freudian or post-Freudian analysis of literature, which sometimes begins to sound very silly when it's applied, for example, to the medieval poem, when the notion of psychology was just totally, it doesn't exist. I mean, it doesn't exist in any way, shape, or form in that world. And, this scholar pointed out that many people who are doing neo-Freudian, as it were, interpretations, it's as if they don't take into account that virtually everything that Freud said has now been debunked by one other scholar or another. I don't mean to sit here and say that there's no relevance to Freud, but somebody did put that to the scholar and said, "You mean to say that Freud is all wrong? And the scholar replied, well, look, let's face it. Freud was the strong poet of the century, referring to Harold Bloom's notion of a strong poet and so forth. So, you know, that got me thinking. Really, our century has been a century in which interpretation, however we mean interpretation, has been what we do. But, you know, literature is, in part, is wonderful because it is to be shared with others. We search inside ourselves, we find solace in literature, but we also want to share it with others. How do we talk about that? I think the ways we talk about it are changing all the time. And the wonderful thing, of course, about looking at recent literature is that we see that it points us out into a world that we don't know, a world where we don't have answers yet. But that's the excitement of it, too. It's very open-ended.
What do we see in this chat among colleagues? First, the discussion reveals the power of poetry. Dr. Stefan Flor recognizes that within the focus world of poetry is found part of the enigma of the American character itself, a love of simplicity and a distrust of emotion coupled with realization that both complexity and passion are integral to 20th century existence. Second, questions arise which challenge the neatness of an argument. What do you do with Wallace Stevens, I ask? Part of any good discussion is that members should pose questions which allow the group to broaden its analytic framework. Third, comparisons and contrasts arise naturally. Stevens and Williams, for instance, are contrasted in ways that these poets were not in the previous lectures. Fourth, autobiographical reflections arise. Dr. Stefan Flor recalls her teacher, the great Scott Ivor Winters, and how his analytic framework shaped her own. This kind of discussion is a good prelude to putting together this section of the course. What, we might ask, are we to do with all this information? To begin, students should talk about what they have read with their colleagues. Whether in person or over the internet, these conversations are an invaluable part of shaping ideas. After some talk, students might then explore connections among the works they have read. You might, for instance, select a broad theme such as the role of women and then particularize this treatment with a theme of selected works. Or you might take two authors who appear to be close to their visions but who express those visions differently. Langston Hughes and Rita Dove, for example, differ in their constructions of African American culture and history. And yet, how is their message similar in such works as The Negro Speaks of Rivers and Wingfoot Lake? As you begin to put your ideas together, don't forget the idea of voiced writing expressed by Nancy Stefan Flor in her lecture. Make what you are reading your own. Marble in the ideas of others with your own perceptions and observations. In this way, the connections you make as you read will become your own. They'll become personal, part of your own quilt, part of that which is important to you because the message you have found and constructed is, to you, meaningful.